Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you, Isabel, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Georg, and everybody for being here and inviting me. This is a real treat. Title of my talk, as Isabel noted, is between Critique and Autonomy, Reflections on Artificial Intelligence as a Complex Ecosystem. And the premise of this talk, which I'm sure can be more or less gleaned from its title, is that I want to think about artificial intelligence as an ecologically complex system, and that doing so also requires navigating thorny debates concerning AI's autonomy and its need for critique. Further, the talk contends that steering this course demands certain tools from the theoretical humanities. What's offered here, however, is less a meditation on the state of AI and the theoretical humanities generally, and much more of an entry point into a series of debates concerning AI as a metaphysical, political, and AI in its metaphysical, political, and ecological existence underway in fields strongly influenced by the history of critical theory and continental philosophy, and also operating under the umbrella of posthumanism and speculative and materialist philosophy. And we should note here that posthumanism, I'm not referring to the more, I guess you could say, popular transhumanist philosophy. This is quite distinct. Now, I back into the need for what I call an ecologically complex view of AI through various tensions and dead ends that arise in two competing theoretical discourses. One stresses the autonomy and even alien nature of AI systems, and the other emphasizes the environmental dependency and impact of these algorithmic systems. Along the way, I trace the ways in which these differing conceptual projects also become legible through divergent but equal investments in Marx's work on automation, more specifically the machine question. But ultimately, certain intractable problems regarding machine learning and its relation to the interiority and exteriority of algorithmic systems will give us permission to search for a revised conception of ecological complexity in the work of Conrad Hal Waddington and Alfred North Whitehead. Such a reframing will also seed new potentials for political critique and also reaffirm the central importance of the humanities for engaging AI futures. This talk is broken up into 4 parts: autonomy, critique, opacity, and complexity. Section 1, autonomy. Let me start by turning to the media and design theorist Benjamin Bratton. In a piece for an edited collection on computing, AI, and speculative philosophy, Bratton walks us through many of the problems associated with determining the existence of machine cognition based on a false analogy with human intelligence. As he insists, and this is a quote, we would do better to allow that in our universe, thinking is much more diverse and even alien than our own particular case. The real philosophical lessons of AI will have less to do with humans teaching machines to think than with machines teaching humans a fuller and truer range of what thinking can be, end quote. For Bratton, what's at stake in getting clear on whether machines are thinking not only concerns resolving certain hard metaphysical problems, but it also and equally concerns the ability to navigate legal, political, and ethical questions regarding the rights, capacities, and agencies of those non-human intelligences. These latter questions become all the more pressing once we move closer toward the material and infrastructural distribution of AI at a planetary scale, all of which begins to make the far-fetched dreams of those new sphere theologians of Silicon Valley who prophesized wrapping the Earth in a layer of synthetic intelligence seem realizable, if not in some strange way, already here. The wager, then, is that intelligence and thought have far too long been circumscribed by the material constraints of human biology, the material constraints of human biology, and the latter in no way exhaust the possibilities for the former. Intelligence is more expansive and more complex than its contingent realization in Homo sapiens, and AI gives us a taste of other parameters for sapience. While the common sense discourse on AI, which continues to stoke fear and uncertainty in the general public, insists on using human intelligence as transcendental criteria for intelligence generally, such Turing tests are underwritten, and not surprisingly, by anthropocentrism. Not only do such criteria fail to capture the way AI researchers actually regard the intelligence of their machine learning algorithms, there's little interest, for example, among most or many computer scientists and engineers in having their humanness reflected back to them. But using such classificatory schema also repeat all the old sins of speciesism by failing to affirm a wide variety of non-human intelligences, whether they be expressed in non-human animals or in algorithmic machines. It's not hard to see why this line of argumentation would have wide appeal, especially among those looking for histories of technology that fall outside anthropocentric frames, or among those searching for ways to affirm non-human thought and sensibility through a myriad of post-human discourses, including animal studies, plant studies, queer ecology, new materialism, and so on. What's more, running throughout Bratton's line of reasoning, which is developed more explicitly in philosophical terms by Reza Negarestani, Ray Brassier, and Peter Wolfendale, and other so-called neo-rationalists, is the claim that algorithms enact forms of rationality that are in some fundamental sense alien to what we tend to regard as human reason, which is to say, these algorithms synthesize and model data in ways that have no analog in the human world, and it's precisely the recognition of these functionalities as intelligence expressible in different material substrates that tears down the transcendental barriers to the non-human world that have been firmly in place, at least since Kant. It's no surprise, then, that this capacity to think the existence of thinking outside its correlation to human thinking pairs nicely with the much wider research program in post-continental philosophy to resist what Quintin Meillassoux famously calls correlationism, or the constant correlation between being and thought in modern post-Kantian philosophy. This isn't to say, however, that the intelligent acts humans perform are of little interest. Quite the contrary. Reza Negarestani, who has perhaps developed this line of thought further than anyone, affirms his work as a kind of enlightened humanism. But it's a perverse humanism, no doubt, that extracts the essential core of humanism, namely rational agency, from its contingent evolutionary manifestation in Homo sapiens, and affirms that there are other substrates capable of realizing this program. Such a functionalist program for the autonomy of reason recognizes that reason is an abstract protocol, only incidentally and not essentially tied to carbon-based matter, and can be realized in silicon or some other material. And so, what has, since antiquity, been viewed as the most human of activities, namely rational activity, is actually what is most inhuman in the human. It's the alien vector within humanism. Thus, and this is crucial, the rational acts performed by AI systems are less anti- or non-human than they are inhuman actions, inasmuch as they express what is already alien within the human, namely reason. This points the way toward a much more ambitious collective philosophical program that tries to make good on the unfulfilled Hegelian promise of realizing collective self-conscious rationality, only now this is actualized through the artificialization of ourselves as a species. This is philosophy conceived as a program to re-engineer the human on a more rational, inhuman template. Admittedly, the latter thesis about inhuman engineering as a revived Hegelianism is less interesting for our purposes than are the especially strong claims about the autonomy of rationality, and more specifically, the assertion that intelligence is irreducible to the historical and/or evolutionary contingencies of material systems. What's more, by affirming the synthetic rationality realized in, for example, a neural network, we're actually getting much closer, according to Negarestani, to grasping intelligence as it is in itself, outside its correlation to the biological particulars of the human, than we are studying its enactment through the embodied cognition of humans. Section 2, critique. It is precisely this affirmation of the autonomy of intelligence that could not be further from work in critical AI studies. As the AI scholar Kate Crawford argues in seemingly direct opposition to Bratton, Negarestani, and others, AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. Rather, artificial intelligence is both embodied and material, made from natural resources, fuel, human labor, infrastructures, logistics, histories, and classifications. AI systems are not autonomous, rational, or able to discern anything without extensive, computationally intensive training with large data sets or predefined rules and rewards, end quote. Thus, what Crawford, along with a growing number of theorists hailing from critical media and technology studies, post and decolonial theory, and elsewhere argue is essentially this. Machine learning as part of a much wider social, political, and machine learning is part of much wider social, political, and biophysical environments, and these environments tend to get disregarded or sidelined in the enthusiasm over the possibilities of synthetic intelligence. The challenge, according to Crawford, is seeing past, for example, our enthusiasm over the imperceptible patterns in data machine learning algorithms are capable of finding in order to see the labor, materials, and infrastructure required to produce such results. For as she explains elsewhere, each small amount of convenience an Amazon Echo provides, be it answering a question, turning on a light, or playing a song, requires a vast planetary network fueled by the extraction of non-renewable resources, or non-renewable materials, labor, and data. The claim here is that AI techniques need to be demystified. Behind the black box of machine learning, and the opacity manufactured by big tech companies, there are vast political, economic, social, and material systems spread across the global north and south that are asymmetrically affected by something as seemingly straightforward as training an algorithm to make a recommendation based on user preferences. These systems make up the hard and soft infrastructures concealed behind the slick and efficient operation of mathematical tools, and are best characterized, according to Mary Gray and Siddhartha Suri, as ghost work, the invisible but always present laboring force necessary for AIs to build models, to make recommendations, and so on. As Matteo Pasquinelli and Vladin Jolar put it, all training data sets are implicitly a diagram of the division of human labor that AI has to analyze and automate. Data sets for image recognition, for instance, record the visual labor that drivers, guards, and supervisors usually perform during their tasks. Even scientific data sets rely on scientific labor, experiment planning, laboratory organization, and analytical observation, end quote. In light of this invisible workforce, what we require then are techniques for visualizing the physical systems of work and exploitation, of resource management and data extraction, of digital sovereignty and geopolitical alliance. And this is precisely what Crawford provides. She offers a planetary cartography of smart computing, one that ranges over the lithium mines, the laboring minds and bodies, the elaborate technologies of data extraction and classification, as well as the modalities of sovereignty, security, and finance born out of artificial intelligence at scale. Such a cartography of AI is meant to be disenchanting. It's what allows us to look under the hood and actually see how the engine runs. And what's revealed are indeed infrastructures, industries, and power dynamics, but ultimately what comes into focus for her is that AI is a manifestation of highly organized capital backed by vast systems of extraction and logistics, with supply chains that wrap around the entire planet. On this reading, it's the critique and redirection of the quote-unquote empires of AI that are ultimately at stake. And to be sure, an AR cartography comes to function for Crawford as a strategic intervention. This is because creating atlases is precisely what the AI empire does. The AI industry, she writes, is making and normalizing its own proprietary maps as a centralized God's eye view of human movement, communication, and labor. This is a desire, Crawford continues, not to create an atlas of the world, but to be the atlas of the world, the dominant way of seeing. In this perspective, sorry, that was a mix-up of quotation in my own words. End quote. In this perspective, the old adage that the map is not the territory no longer holds water. The AI map is the territory. As algorithms map patterns, the landscapes of planetary movement, communication, work, trade, war, and so on are also simultaneously being charted. These are the complex and very often invisible architectures of the planetary that only become visible and thinkable on condition that we see artificial intelligence as physically embedded in the world and redesigning the Earth. Returning to the previous section, it seems clear that focusing on the abstract, autonomous, and even alien qualities of computational system conceals the very real physical processes involved in training algorithms, in building models and recommender systems. It's not by magic or some mystical force that algorithms are endowed with their learning capabilities. No, these capacities are built step by step from labor, resources, and data, all of which can be traced and visualized. To insist then on the autonomy of these systems is ultimately to disavow the planetary scale dependencies that make the illusion of autonomy possible. What this means is that the continued mystification and even quasi-theologization of deep learning techniques not only mask the real planetary costs of artificial intelligence, only masks the real planetary cost of artificial intelligence. AI is not alien to human intelligence in the way we might think then. This is because AI is built out of the ghostwork of human intelligence and laboring bodies, and is, in this sense, utterly dependent on the distributed workforce of human and non-human labor. And that yet this labor, this productive labor, remains alienated from what it produces. With this characterization of alienation, the Marxist critique of AI comes into focus. This reading is certainly implicit in Crawford, but it becomes more explicit, I would say, in Pasquinelli. As Marx makes clear in both the Grundrisse and Capital, technical machinery is not science's analysis of nature, but the analysis of labor. Indeed, it's the division of labor that drives technological development and not the other way around. However, once labor is transformed by the scientific nature of production, the collective knowledge of laborers is objectified in machines as fixed capital, and workers are alienated from their own collective knowledge that has become the knowledge of science and technology. This means that the so-called intelligence displayed by machine learning algorithms is in no way autonomous or free from human productive labor. And what our cartography of AI does politically is map the global exploitation of labor required to design and build these systems. What's intriguing, although perhaps only indirectly relevant to our discussion, is that the so-called autonomy of AI, peddled by Bratton, Negrestani, Ray Brassier, and others, is just as often built on the back of a Marxist political project. Without going too far down the rabbit hole of post-Marxist political theory, it's worth pointing out that it's Marx's Grundrisse instead of his Capital that serves as the foundation for this political project. This argument, which has been repeated many times by the Italian post-operist in post-Italian operist thought, boils down to this. The fragment on machines in the Grundrisse provides a kind of blueprint for algorithmic autonomy. If we move beyond the so-called dogmatic Marxisms that identify technology with fixed capital and dead labor, then we begin to see how for Marx, the evolution of machinery also indexes a level of development of productive powers that are unleashed but never totally contained by the capitalist economy. Within capitalist relations of production, the surplus labor that results from increased automation is reabsorbed into the capitalist economy. But for those who put an inestimable faith in Marx's fragment on machines, disposable time can and should be reclaimed, and it can serve as the basis for a new form of the commons. As the Italian media theorist Tiziana Terranova argues, quote, we need to ask not only how algorithmic automation works today, mainly in terms of the control and monetization, feeding the debt economy, but also what kind of time and energy it subsumes and how it might be made to work once taken up by different social and political assemblages, autonomous ones, not subsumed by or subjected to the capitalist drive to accumulation and exploitation. In other words, What would it mean to subvert the exploitative uses of computational technologies and use them to build infrastructures like universal basic income that could support the production of a post-capitalist commons? Of course, this argument very much depends on the autonomy of algorithmic technologies, or at least from human labor, so that complicated infrastructural work can get done, which frees up humans to pursue other collective activities. The point here is not to continue down the path of Marxist political thought. Rather, it's to suggest that both projects could be read as overtly political, even if the critical environmentalists accuse the algorithmic autonomists of disavowing the political nature of their work to prop up the autonomy of computational practices. What's more, it may even be the case that these differences can be fought out in explicitly Marxist terms, and much more specifically over how the machine question is configured differently in the Grundrisse and Capital. Section 3, opacity. In order to intervene in this admittedly abstract discourse, I want to turn briefly to recent work in the social and legal sciences on algorithmic governance to get a better sense of what might be at stake. The legal scholar, Frank Pasquale, insists that in a world where our systems of government and finance are increasingly run by machine learning algorithms, the computational tools that are making decisions on our behalf need to be made available for audit. Indeed, as Pasquale, along with a host of other legal and policy scholars, have made clear, algorithmic accountability is absolutely central to upholding democratic practices. The legal philosopher Muriel Hildebrandt, for her part, argues that the admittedly imperfect system of constitutional democracy has two minimal requirements. On the one hand, people live under rules of their own making, and on the other hand, people have to be able to contest how the rules are made and implemented. For this, decision-making practices need to be made transparent, so those who are ruled are not dominated, but participate in the democratic process itself. The rationality of law and the granularities of decision-making require transparency and accountability. But for Hildebrandt, with that rise of algorithmic governance, where algorithms actually do the work of anticipating and regulating the behavior of its citizens, the transparency of democratic practices is fundamentally threatened, since the decision-making processes used is itself shrouded in trade secrets. Not resting content with such technological fatalism, however, Pasquale is more optimistic about the possibilities for demanding transparency and offers a series of recommendations for how to realize an intelligible society increasingly run by algorithmic machines. The trouble with this story, however, as computer scientists like Paul Durisch and Jenna Burrell note, is that it fails to account for the different levels of algorithmic opacity. Burrell, for her part, outlines three such layers, which ultimately trouble many of the arguments in favor of algorithmic transparency. Now, the first two levels of opacity are straightforward enough and are well documented in legal scholarship. On the one hand, the algorithms that run our search engines, that determine our credit scores, or that assist Alexa in ordering the best-rated Mexican takeout within 5 blocks, are all protected in trade secrets. But notice, even if these algorithms were visible, they are mathematically complex abstractions whose realization in code is unintelligible to just about everyone but the highly trained specialist. Thus, even if the first form of opacity could be overcome, algorithmic operations will still be far from transparent to the general public. Still, these forms of opacity do not necessarily lead us to the conclusion, or they don't have to lead us to the conclusion, that AI is a quote-unquote black box. There are numerous policy recommendations, pieces of legislation, and training programs that could help shed light on the algorithms that govern our lives. Despite these efforts, there is yet another layer of opacity that presents a far greater challenge to the ideal of transparency. To understand this, it's important to recognize that machine learning techniques do not require, in the way traditional techniques of statistical modeling do, that we identify the functional relationships between variables in advance. Instead, with machine learning, data are mined using algorithmic techniques neural networks and so on, to identify patterns in data that inform a model that can be tested and improved upon. For example, an algorithm for handwriting recognition is exposed to massive amounts of training data, but it is not programmed with the concept of the alphabet or even with the shape of certain letters. Instead, it works bottom up to recognize that certain configurations of strokes are characteristic of certain letters. And with this, the algorithm may very well be able to confirm handwriting samples, and as a human interpreter of outcomes, I'm satisfied with how the algorithm performed. Still, there's no way to know what the algorithm knows. In the case of social media feeds and trending topics, a computer scientist can certainly describe the algorithm, its weightings and so on, and hypothesize why one topic trends and another one doesn't. But they cannot actually peer into the algorithm and see how the sausage is made. The patterns an algorithm picks out in data are not only ephemeral and almost impossible to forensically trace, but they are statistical and probabilistic, and so not in themselves meaningful in human terms. What we're left with is a human interpretation imposed on mathematical processes of statistical optimization, but not a picture of why this decision was made at this specific time. This leads Burrell and others to conclude that when a computer learns and consequently builds its own representation of a classification decision, it does so without regard for human comprehension. Machine optimizations based on trading data do not naturally accord with human semantic explanations. The workings of machine learning algorithms can escape full understanding and interpretation by humans, even those with specialized training, such as computer scientists. Here's why this matters for us. It's hard to deny, for example, that ubiquitous algorithmic auditing would go a long way toward creating what Pascal calls an informed citizenry that takes an active role in understanding and intervening how our data are harvested and used. Despite these efforts, there are aspects of algorithmic decision-making that refuse to be objectified and that stubbornly resist comprehension, even in the face of strict auditing practices performed by the most skilled engineers. And if this opacity is made explicit in the legal and social scientific research on algorithmic governance, then it's no less true for the critical environmental discourse on artificial intelligence. Although Crawford and others offer an ambitious program for mapping the complex geographies of labor, data, and resource extraction, their cartographies of AI will always be in some sense incomplete. It's true, of course, that their ambition is not to create the map of AI and repeat all the old sins of the AI empire they're trying to critique, but their incomplete map is generally conceived of as a limitation in perspective, i.e., there is no perspective that captures all perspectives, and not a limitation in the conceptual frame itself. Recall here that what's at stake in cartographies of AI is bringing the material and infrastructural systems that support an algorithm into view, that is, seeing, mapping, and critiquing them. And while it's surely the case that we can point to increasingly complex networks of material infrastructure and see that they're brought into relation with the exploited labor of knowledge workers, and also show how these elements feed into the selection of training data, we cannot say with any kind of certainty why these elements have come together at this time for an algorithm to make this recommendation. What role these elements play for the algorithm, their importance, and in conjunction with other factors is off limits, I'm afraid. It is as if on the conceptual model offered by Crawford and others, the inner workings of an AI are visible if we look closely enough at the environments that influence it. There is a kind of ontological flattening at work here, where the inside is the outside and the one reflects the other. This is a level of transparency that's not just a technical impossibility, but it's also, I want to suggest, an epistemological one. Complexity. This brings us back to the first section of this talk on autonomy. Without buying into the problematic argument concerning the artificialization of human reasoning, there's still something I think we need to preserve about the opacity of AI. Whether we call this rationality is less interesting to me than shoring up for ourselves a bit of algorithmic alterity. The risk in doing so, which the environmental critique of AI has managed to sniff out, is that algorithmic impenetrability is taken to be synonymous with a form of autonomy that disavows environmental dependency. Such logics of computational freedom beholden as they are to the values of the liberal subject, are admittedly in the background of much of the discourse on algorithmic autonomy. What we require instead is a conception of media relation that does not give in to the temptation to reduce the system to its environments, which means that we need to account for the vast networks of labor and resources that condition the material and functional operations of machine learning, on the one hand, but do so in an ecological theory of algorithmic media that does not predetermine how those environments are organized for and by the algorithm. On the other. In short, we cannot prescribe what an environment is and will become for a system in advance of that system's unfolding. The environment does not pre-exist the system. This finally brings us to the question of ecological complexity. Now, my way into complexity is admittedly oblique, since I want to avoid some of the troubles that haunt the complexity sciences conceived on a mathematical template. There's no doubt that complex dynamical systems have, for at least the last half century or more, proven to be an especially powerful mathematical language for explaining systems that contain, for example, multiple stable trajectories, that undergo change induced by different causes, that experience large-scale change as a result of very small shifts in the environment, and that cannot be reduced to their parts. All of these processes can be modeled using nonlinear differential equations, and this has proven to be a game changer for multiple scientific fields, including the life and environmental sciences. The trouble with this picture, which I have written about elsewhere, is that while the environments and causal mechanisms have gotten more complex, so have the mathematics that model these mechanisms. The sciences of complexity haven't gained the right to sit at the head of the table in many domains of theoretical science because they're in the business of characterizing irreducible heterogeneity or granting physical and biological systems their own irreducible Umwelten. The power of nonlinear dynamical systems lies in its ability to demystify what was once mysterious. At bottom, material systems, biological, physical, and social, are algorithmically determined, and the sciences of complexity are tasked with discovering the algorithms on which these systems run. The portrait that's painted for scientists, life and environmental scientists included, is an attractive one. The functionality of a system fits into a larger mechanistic picture in which the distributed mechanisms of feedback and recursion that once baffled scientists sit alongside the complex behavior of other physical, social, and economic systems. And so what we're left with is a conceptual frame that tries to eliminate as much as mathematically possible the indeterminacy in systems. And so if I invoke complexity here, it's because I'm drawing on the sense in which the term was used by the mid-20th century mathematician and theoretical biologist Conrad Hell Waddington. Now, Waddington, who is perhaps best known for having coined the term epigenetics, was just as responsible for the birth of the complexity sciences. And behind both of these conceptions is the process metaphysics of Alfred North Whitehead. As a close reader of Whitehead, Waddington showed how genetic and epigenetic systems are not isolated from one another in embryonic development. Instead, development is understood as a complex system in multidimensional phase space, though Waddington was especially careful to emphasize that the parameters selected to model a developing system are artifacts of the modeling environment. And because of this, we should never forget that the true complexity of a developing system can never be modeled, since it is shaped by at least 3 scales of time that resist objectification in a model, namely evolutionary time, the time of life history, and the time of physiology. In other words, development is more complex than the sciences of complexity. Waddington's intuition of irreducible complexity is in no small part indebted to Whitehead. In fact, Waddington himself notes in 1975 that his conception of the creode, which is Waddington's technical term for how an environment gives shape to a system's trajectory in phase space, should have been more explicitly Whiteheadian in its original articulation. This is because, as Waddington explains and comes to realize later in his work, the specificity of a system's trajectory is not determined by an external switch or series of switches, but by the concrete ways in which the environment becomes relevant to the system in the process of development. In other words, the true complexity of a system's development concerns how the environment shapes and is shaped by the system. It's Whitehead who develops this in more explicitly ecological terms. Entities, for him, do not influence each other by bumping up against one another as they did for much of the history of Western metaphysics. Rather, they actually enter into the constitution of one another. Entities, or occasions of experience, become what they are because of the way they incorporate, or what Whitehead calls prehend, other entities into their own becoming, a process known as concrescence. Hence, there is no dualistic opposition between self and other. The self just is the integration of its environments. This is why Whitehead explains that his philosophy of organism is mainly devoted to the task, and this is a quote from Process and Reality, is mainly devoted to the task of making clear the notion of being present in another entity, end quote. Now, a lesser emphasized aspect of Whitehead's philosophy, which tempers some of the recent enthusiasm in continental philosophy over his metaphysical relationism, is that there is no bare repetition of the other's experience in the prehending occasion. Causal efficacy is not all that's at stake. If this were the case for Whitehead, then nothing would happen. The world would not move. And so, if one entity actually enters into the constitution of another, which is required for Whitehead to overcome metaphysical isolationism, then would have to do so uniquely. What this means for Whitehead is that each entity integrates its proximate and distal environments in a single way, so that each and every coordination of environmental data cannot be objectified in another occasion of experience. Each occasion is at once connected and disconnected to what conditions it. And this is as true for events of human cognition as it is for technological automation, largely conceived for Whitehead. So, by way of conclusion, if we were to use this sketch of ecological complexity to alleviate some of the tension between autonomy and critique in the discourse of AI, then the upshot is that we can now account for the fact that heterogeneous environments actually enter into the constitution of machine learning systems. They literally make it possible for these algorithms to perform their work. They are the material infrastructures that Crawford and others map. But on the other hand, environments are coordinated in highly specific ways, each time and on every occasion of algorithmic integration, or concrescence for Whitehead. This concrescence of data, resources, and labor, to continue with Whitehead's terminology, cannot be externalized into intelligible models, even though the algorithm's concrescence is literally constituted by what is external to it. I cannot say, in other words, what an environment is for the system. On this template, the ecological complexity of AI indexes the fact that the internality and externality of the algorithm are not opposed. In fact, they are required by one another. It is impossible for one to exist without the other. If one of the most important lessons of the cartographic critique of AI is that algorithmic systems are embedded in much wider environments that they use and exploit, then this is no less true for the conception of ecological complexity I'm proposing here. What's different, however, and this is where I'll finish up, is that blunt instruments of critique no longer hold water. Hence, we need to become more situated in our critical interventions. Of course, situated critique is a hallmark of the political left, and yet more often than not, as we saw it before, we find the reification of non-human rationality or the environment. It's all or nothing, which is precisely what we saw before. Instead, the kind of critical program of AI that's offered here regards machine learning as radically situated, which is to say, a singular concrescence of data and resources that cannot be externalized. So any critical philosophy worth its salt has to be agile and anticipatory and thus speculative in some way, but in a very specific sense. It needs to persist in refusing to authorize how an algorithmic system is coordinated by and conditions its environments. This is a refusal that neither the algorithmic autonomists nor the critical environmentalists seem willing to acknowledge, but necessary to affirm, to affirm that interiority and exteriority are not opposed or irreconcilable, but are part and parcel of what it means to be, and for an algorithm to be ecologically complex. Thank you.